we are almost at the end of our bootcamp. Let's there it goes. Let's go for the last session. Not this one. Yes, with Giovanni Di Noto. I think you're here, and yes, you're connected. You are co-host. Welcome, Giovanni. Giovanni works at Cloudy Boss. It's a group of companies, also Omega. He will explain now a bit better what he does. But for this last hour of the bootcamp, he's gonna talk us about the BDLT in its application in the logistics sector. So hopefully you enjoy this last session. And Giovanni, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I share my screen? I should be able to do that, right? Correct. Okay.
Yeah.
So let me fire up the presentation. Thank you very much to Insomnia and Blockpool for inviting me, of course. And let me share my screen. Let me know. Here it is. Okay, and let me know when you see basically my screen. I think.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Fantastic. So let's jump in, and I'll talk a bit about the agenda. So what I'm planning to do today is really give you a bit of a background credit, more studies, about the topic that I'm going to talk about. Give you a lot of context, and I know that you had already a few presentations on blockchain today, so I will browse quickly, but feel free to intervene or stop me if there is any question. Otherwise, I'm going to assume that the fundamentals and the baselines are already there. We'll then, in terms of context, jump into the logistics context, and then we will go and look at the context of DLT in logistics. What are the protagonists? What are some of the examples there? And what I will insist on is where are the challenges? Those first EDLT application in logistics, what type of challenges and solutions have we been experiencing over the past few years since that whole discipline started? So in terms of background, that presentation is really collecting a lot of information from a lot of organizations there. So this is not just basically the fruit of just one person. If you want to know more, right, that subject is a very, very vast subject, and in 1 hour, there's so much I can tell you. But if you are interested, you can connect either with Klaipeda University or in the area of maritime logistics with the Connect to Small Ports EU. There are comprehensive course, so the equivalent of what we're going to go through, but over 10 hours of explanation, detailed explanation on blockchain fundamentals and the application in logistics. So I know that Connect to Small Ports has a certificate. It's all free of charge. It's financed by European Union. So if you're interested, you can go there if you need more knowledge on that particular discipline. In terms of introduction, again, very, very quickly, because I'm sure you've seen that already with other presenters today, but in terms of general DLT, distributed ledger technology, blockchain core benefits, what are they with respect to centralized type of system? Well, they're there, right? Security, immutability, verifiability, integrity of the data, the immediacy of access to that data, the programmability, be it with smart contract or other type of mechanisms, greater transparency, easier auditability of the data, and most importantly, disintermediation. So the ability to have process and data manipulation without any intermediate, as opposed to a centralized model. And of course, enhanced efficiencies, especially in logistics, where there's still a lot of paper-based type of processes. Now, again, I'm sure you've seen that before, but the reason why DLT blockchain is important and not just another new technology is because compared to the last informational revolution in the 90s with introduction of World Wide Web, what blockchain is bringing really to the table is that idea of digital scarcity, okay, as opposed to the digital abundance that we've experienced for the past 30 years. Now, the focus for the past 10 years has been really on cryptocurrencies and fintech, and you've got here a bit of a representation of what it is. But the important thing to understand is that industrial blockchain application, industrial DLT, so blockchain outside cryptocurrency, is now becoming very, very important. And it's where probably most of the use cases actually are. Cryptocurrency and fintech being only one particular domain. And this was reflected basically in the Gartner hype cycle recently in 2019, where blockchain in supply chain, blockchain in logistics was actually the top of the hype, and one of the most interesting subjects still is. So what's the overall context here? The overall context is really that idea of sustainable development goals. Where are we with that? And you're going to see the relationship with logistics, the demographics, which are driving automation, and that transition toward a globalized and distributed economics type of world. So in the area of sustainable goals, we all broke. What do I mean by that? If we look at the 17 sustainable development goals that we are supposed to reach by 2030, we already know that there's the equivalent of a 2.5 trillion budgetary gap in actually reaching those goals. And so this commands a complete rethink in the way we are aiming for those goals. And we will see that there's impact on logistics and direction, for example, in Europe, undertaken because of that gap. But it's not just about the budgetary gap. It's about the fact that if we look at sustainability from a consumption perspective, well, if we run the P&L of the planet, you know, we've been running at a loss now for the past 50 years, right? Which is we consume as humanity, you know, far more than what the biosphere is capable of regenerating every year. And we know what the problem is, you know, broken line economics, crystallized by the supply-demand type of classical view on economics. And that, of course, creates a problem because it fabricates demand where there's no need, it invents scarcity where there's actually abundance, and it uses fiat currencies which do not relate to any type of physical reality. So what's the solution to that? Well, the driving toward basically circular economics, right, which really started in an official way with that seminal June 2015 decision by the Hague District Court, which ordered the government of Netherlands to implement a circular economy. But what has happened, especially last year, is that because of COVID, and because of the impact of COVID on actually that overshoot day, on that consumption that you can see on that last bar here, European Union has taken notice and basically has triggered that move towards sustainable and smart mobility strategy, so green logistics. So if there is a core theme in 2021 and in coming months, it's really that notion of green logistics in Europe, where we intend to lead the way. So that's the sustainable development goal type of context insofar logistics is concerned. Demographics, what are we talking about here? Well, aging population, the fact that irrespective of countries, the support ratio all around the world are basically collapsing and keep on collapsing. And that, of course, creates a lot of issues in terms of fiscal imbalances and the double whammy of a growing population, but a proportionally decreasing workforce, which is coined as the millennial cliff, basically. So why is this important to understand? Well, it's important because it's driving automation. This is the driver behind any type of industry 4.0 or smart logistics, automated logistics type of direction. Globalization is another macro trend, which is important to understand. And what are we talking about here? We're talking about the fact that the whole world was already shifting, but there is acceleration happening from a 200 top-down nation type of world to a potentially 4,000 or more, depending on how we calculate, bottom-up smarter cities. And COVID last year has really accelerated that trend. Why? Well, because of logistics and supply chain. What COVID has unveiled, especially in the first part of 2020, is how fragile our globalized supply chain are and how risk exposed we were to those type of situations. So the trend toward globalization, toward smart cities, is really increasing because of COVID. At the same time, what do you have? Well, you get that shift to distributed economics, and that's really driven by blockchain, by what has been happening over the past 10 years. But what are we talking about when we talk about that? Well, we're talking fundamentally about organizational transformation, the fact that we have shifted from vertical organization, top-down organization, to bottom-up organization during the 90s and the beginning of the millennium. But today, over the past 10 years, the new model which is emerging, and that's a new organizational model, is that notion of ecosystem, that notion of a distributed ecosystem of independent organization acting in unison, acting under a DLT framework, under a shared, basically informational type of system. That's a new way of thinking about organization. It's a new model that we didn't have before. And so one of the manifestation of that, of one of the accentuation in a trend which already existed is, for example, the disappearance of moving away from the corporate model. So you can see there are the corporate model in terms of average lifespan. This is S&P 500 in US, but you can see how that average life cycle of corporation is actually collapsing. We moved from something which was around 67 years in average at the beginning of the 20th century to now 15 years or less. Okay, so that's telling us quite a lot about the fact that the corporate conventional model is fastly disappearing. Okay, so these are general type of context and landscape comments, but what about logistics? Well, if we could look at logistics, and if we look at the use case for DLT, the thing to understand with logistics is that notion of inefficiencies. Okay, so what are we talking about? Well, this is an 8 trillion euro, more or less, type of industry. It's in growth mode. Okay, it's scheduled to double by 2026, but there are enormous inefficiencies. They're not big in terms of percentage respect to the total industry value, but in terms of absolute value, they're still kind of phenomenal, right? So if I look at just theft and errors in logistics, we're talking, 50 billion euro a year. That's the cost of just theft and error. But the problem is much bigger than that. There's, in fact, 8 categories of issues and inefficiencies and cost efficiencies and missed revenues in logistics. Safety, tracking issues. If you want an example of that, the terrible Beirut port accident last year was an illustration of what can really go wrong when things are not managed properly. So 7,000 injured, 180 deaths, and 15 billion euro in terms of damage. Operational inefficiencies, that's probably one of the biggest driver toward DLT project in logistics. Most or much of the logistics process are still paper-based. There's a lot of intermediaries, there's a lot of regulations. It's actually a very, very complex process to move any type of cargo from point A to point B. Spoilage, think about food, pharma, chemicals, anything of a perishable nature is really a huge cost for the industry. Cyber attacks, okay, again, if we want an example, well, don't go further than June 2020, Maersk, data leakage, the cost of which was a 300 million euro incident, so not a small thing at all. Provenance opacity, what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is that the consumer, the end point of the logistics process is increasingly asking for transparency. We want to know where the goods are coming from, where that particular fruit or product that I am consuming come from. And right now, we do not necessarily know that. There's little transparency on everything which has to do from a provenance perspective or from a logistics perspective. So it's still an opaque type of process predominantly. There's other problems. Most of the issues that the consumer doesn't necessarily see have to do with disputes which are related to chain of custody. As I mentioned earlier, the logistic process is a complex one, and typically the disputes are between operators within that supply chain process. Payments, of course. Cargo theft and insurance fraud, we mentioned earlier, 50 billion annual cost, including errors. And we see a net increase with these two. So I repeat, a large industry, but a lot of inefficiencies, which are very, very costly. Okay, so what is the trend there? If we look at the industry now and categorizing that industry into the three main way to categorize logistics, which is long route, mid route, and short circuit, the last mile. Well, with a long route, you know, the best way of thinking about that is to remember the 2016 Engine Milano bankruptcy, right? Which is there's going to be a lot of consolidation. A lot of consolidation has already happened on the long route, but it's going to keep on basically concentrating, and that's because the long route traffic is, because of globalization, is you know, scheduled to decrease. In the area of both long and mid route, automation. Okay, we talked about automation before, and automation and efficiencies in the way we manage that mid route is really what drives the next steps in logistics. So a lot of techniques there, a lot of basically driverlessness, platooning, muling. These are some of the things which are happening in that area. Multimodality, and of course, sustainable logistics are some of the drivers there. And then the battlefield is really on the last mile, right? How we achieve efficient, congestion-free last mile type of a short circuit. So is it drones? Is it, again, you've got that idea of automation there, but this is where most of the investment is happening actually on that last mile. Now, DLT in logistics. There's many, actually, I should not say many. The whole trend with starting applying DLT to the logistics industry started really toward the end of 2018, and then has basically grown and keep on growing quite significantly. There's many actors there, and they are either specialized by industry, so people like SkyCell, for example, in the pharmaceutical sector, or by function. They innovate based on a particular function that they are bringing. So, for example, Chain, a US-based company, is focusing on a DLT-based type of approach to muling. So shared economics, but applied to good transportations. There's other players there. TradeLens, driven by IBM, Hyperledger is a big reality. And here locally, we're looking at another initiative called DSL Chain, which we will talk a bit more in a minute. But these are some of the key players. There's also a lot of initiatives also at manufacturing level. So many organizations, many big brands are looking at basically introducing DLT within the context of their supply chain. And again, we'll talk about that in the area of challenges. So if you look at in aggregate to what are the benefits that we want to derive from those DLT implementations, they're pretty much the same, but they apply either to single industry or to single type of features or functions within that industry. But we retrieve there some of the expected benefit that we talked about earlier. So enhanced transparency, providing that actually visibility on provenance, disintermediation across the entire value chain. So can we do things the way they need to be done, but without any freight forwarders or intermediaries in a very highly automated yet very, very safe type of manner. Enhance efficiencies. So we're talking about DLT, and of course one of the consequence of applying DLT is shifting everything which is paper-based to an eDoc, electronic documentation type of format. Payments, automated payment, metadata digitalization. RegTech is also another dimension there, which is if the cargo is subject to regulations. So think about dangerous goods, etc. What are the opportunities there to actually harmonize and create efficiencies in the way we share that information with all the parties? And so one of the key goals, of course, is to reduce, neutralize errors, theft, spoilage, and all of that would be derived from that enhanced type of traceability. Provenance, I mentioned that earlier, both bulk and break bulk cargo. How do we provide the end user with a clear picture of from where the cargo is coming and what type of journey it has taken? Safety, with enhanced tracking. The idea there is that if I can track and know with relative immediacy where my cargo is, chances of losing that cargo or being able to retrieve it are actually enhanced. Cybersecurity, a big aspect with DLT is that it increases not only the safety of the data, but the very context of industrial DLT, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, is actually about all the cybersecurity that you bring with those systems. There's other additional type of benefits. So one of the things, for example, pursued by a DSL Chain initiative is to tokenize and to be able to trade in transit the cargo. So you might say, why is this important? Well, think about bulk cargo such as oil or LNG or gas. The particularity of that type of bulk cargo is that at point of extraction, we're not necessarily calibrating the production based on demand. It doesn't work like that. If you've got a platform extracting LNG or oil, well, you can't just close the tap. You keep on producing irrespective of market demand. And so the ability to trade that cargo while it is traveling is something that, of course, can be done today, but with great difficulty. And so one of the objectives with DSL Chain is actually to enable that tradability of that cargo in transit. And that, of course, introduce all sorts of efficiencies in terms of, savings on storage and all that jazz. Last but not least, and I would relate that back to a point I made earlier related to the European direction with green logistics and smart mobility. The fact that we have now increased visibility on the entire logistics process allow us to do something quite particular, which is, well, we can have now options with logistics, and those options are not necessarily driven by price or cost, but they might be increasingly driven by green type of attributes, right? So that DLT approach is acting as a catalyst, as an enabler for greener logistics. Okay, so that's all good. That seems great on paper, but you know, is this what's happening in reality? Well, yes and no. There are challenges, right? So what we're going to do now is, and I wanted to really to focus on that, is, well, what are the challenges which all of those DLT implementation have been experiencing over the past 2.5 years, right, since that whole supply chain trend started. So let's get into that now. And there's really 8 categories, 10 actually, if we look at the subcategories there, but 8 to 10 categories of challenges. And there's really 2 groups of challenges there. The first 4 that we're going to look at, yes, they are challenges, but they're not challenges specific to logistics. They are challenges specific to any type of DLT implementation. And of course, they also exist in the context of logistics, and they manifest themselves too. So we're going to look at them. And then you've got another group of challenges, the 4 next one, which are already specific to supply chain or more acute in the context of the DLT implementation in supply chain over the past few years. If you want to learn more about those ones, you've got a link there, which I'll invite you to go, and there's blogs and reports on what those problems are, but we're going to look at all of them anyway in detail. So let's look at the first one. So ecosystem formation. What do we mean by that? Well, what we mean by that is that one thing we've noticed with blockchain in general, not just with logistics, is that it seems to be struggling to emerge. You know, it seems like it's still on that pioneering stage where, if you look at conventional way technology has been implemented across other type of technologies, well, you would see that we should be by now in scale-up mode. But the reading that we need to have on that pioneering is very, very delicate, because nobody is denying the power of blockchain and the innovation aspect that blockchain is bringing, which is that first point that I referred to earlier when I was talking about digital scarcity. We know that blockchain, from a paradigm perspective, is really important because it shifts paradigm from an informational management perspective. So we know it's important, and yet the take-up seems to be difficult in the market. But why is that so? For me, the answer to that has nothing to do with the technology itself, but has to do with economics. And it's back to that context element that I was mentioning earlier, which is what is really happening over the past decade, but more acutely, I would say, over the past 3 years, is that we are shifting, we are introducing, we are experiencing a new organizational model that we didn't have before, and that is distributed economics. So ecosystems of independent organization with a life of their own, which are, however, operating under a distributed, streamlined type of informational model. That is something we didn't have in the 20th century or in the 19th century. And so for me, the reason why blockchain is taking more time to actually take up and scale up has to do with the complexity, the change management complexity, the cultural difficulty of actually shifting to that new distributed economics model. Second debate, second challenge faced not only in supply chain, but across other areas, is that debate about on-chain versus off-chain documentation. So how do we understand that problem? Well, the way to understand that problem has to do with actually the first blockchain protocols. Those first blockchain protocols, you know, be it Bitcoin or even Ethereum or Corda or Ripple or other type of protocols, they were all essentially focusing on fintech, on cryptocurrencies type of use case. And the issue with that is that what went on the ledger, what goes on the ledger in those particular use case situation is actually transactional in nature. It's effectively the equivalent of an accounting ledger entry. But in industrial DLT use case, the problem is different. In logistics, for example, when you move a cargo from point A to point B, well, there's a lot of documentation going on. And so the idea of having off-chain documentation is a bit antagonistic, right? Because all the information is very important. And so all of that information should be actually on-chain. So there's those debates going on there with off-chain versus on-chain data. The governance debate, an important one too. And again, it's multidimensional, right? But to give you some examples, right? Bitcoin, for example, we all under the impression that Bitcoin is that fabulous distributed type of ecosystems with 9,000 nodes or more. But the reality of it is that when you look, for example, at the structure of the nodes themselves, you understand that there's a huge concentration there. More than 50% of a network is actually in the hands of 4 operators, right? That you have listed there. So you've got that governance issue there in the sense that, well, if it is really, I would say, cartelized at that level, is the distributed type of argument still valid, right? So, or is it a bit of a delusion? So here's one problem, but you've got similar type of problem, for example, with Ethereum, different nature, but in Ethereum, the elephant in the room, as it's quoted there, is AWS, right? 25% of the network is actually based on one infrastructure provider. And so the problem of the question which are asked are, well, what happens if that infrastructure provider, for a reason or another, decide overnight that any type of DLT application based on Ethereum should be banned? Okay, what happened then? The whole ecosystem might be compromised. So that particular challenge is what has given birth, for example, over the past 12 months, 18 months, to what we call multi-vendor type of infrastructure. So DLT infrastructure, which is completely vendor neutral, okay, not based on IBM or on AWS or on Google Cloud, but actually distributed in a blockchain manner between several providers or more. There's other type of a challenge there. We could talk about open source versus proprietary type of DLT protocol, the problem with fork out, the issues with governance, who's really driving the ecosystem, all sorts of problems there at a protocol level that we can think of. Of course, they're very, very important, with industry DLT as they are with cryptocurrencies. Now, I talked about security earlier and gave an example of what could happen, right? When I mentioned that data leakage incident. But security is effectively a big problem and an answer, to some of those governance challenge that we talked about. So, for example, in the area of how do we combat the issue of dependencies on infrastructure provider, well, you've got that multi-vendor infrastructure provider, which is one of the directions taken by some DLT protocols today to circumvent all of those issues of cartelization, which are contrary to the spirit of what distribution should be all about. The bottom line there is, and more so with industrial DLT, is that you need extremely high level of security, not just of the data, which is built in the idea of DLT itself, but at an infrastructure level, you need to make sure that really your level of security are of an extremely high standard. Now, the next debate, very, very important one in industrial DLT, is the issue of the wrong protocol. Okay, what do I mean by that? And there's probably a few things there that we need to quote. Many, in terms of industrial DLT protocol versus cryptocurrency protocol, the reality is that there's not a lot of dedicated DLT protocol which are really natively of an industrial nature. Most of the protocol out there are predominantly crypto-based. They are about cryptocurrency. Now, why is it important to understand the distinction there? What is important is actually the idea of consensus. While the idea of consensus, the idea of mining, the idea of demonstrating a proof of work or a proof of stake or building a computing cost on one side of the ecosystem, while that idea is very, very important for open type of ecosystems such as Bitcoin or Ethereum, it is something which is not only less important, but kind of counterproductive in the area of industrial DLT. Industrial DLT use case, per definition, are predominantly permissioned type of ecosystem. And what this means is that we still have consensus, but it's really baseline Byzantine fault tolerance. And so if you look at the landscape of protocol out there, there's only two protocols right now which are really focusing on industrial DLT only and exclusively, and that is Hyperledger and Sky. Everything else, your NEM, Cardano, EOS, Stellar, Ripple, Ethereum, Bitcoin, they're all crypto-based. Now you might say, why is this important? Speed. And when we talk about speed, we need to be very, very careful, because even if I focus just on the crypto side of things, the notion of speed and the debates around speed are often ill-founded, right? So for example, some of the topics that you might find out there related to DLT protocol speed have to do with comparisons which probably should not be made in the first place, right? So someone might argue, look, a card provider like Visa or MasterCard is navigating at 20,000 transactions per second. Meanwhile, Bitcoin, is below 10 transactions per second. Well, these are not fair comparisons. Why? Because we're talking and comparing apple and oranges. We're not comparing equivalent type of speed. The less than 10 transactions per second in the context of a financial or cryptocurrency-based protocol has to do with proof of work, has to do with aspect of the protocol, consensus, which are built in. We actually want them to be that slow so that a real computing cost algorithmic can kick in. So it would not be fair to compare orange and apple there. But that doesn't take away the fact that there is still a speed issue and a DLT protocol adequacy depending on the use case. And anything which is of an industrial nature, such as supply chain, for example, ecosystem implementations, the reality is that conventional blockchain protocol, which were designed for cryptocurrency, won't work. Okay, they're not designed for that. They're not designed for the high volume that logistics is going to be able to manage, and they're certainly not designed from a permission perspective the way it needs to be designed in the context of supply chain. So you've got that debate there on what should be the protocol. But the key message I'm delivering there is that as of today, there's only two protocols really that you can rely on for any type of industrial DLT application. Here's an illustration again of a different angle, but similarly to what I said earlier. If you take the case of Bitcoin, for example, so we know that the consensus in Bitcoin is ASIC based. What I mean by that is, in order to carry out a proof of work, the amount of algorithmic and processing that needs to go on is such that today's the most of the miners in Bitcoin ecosystems are running on application specific type of hardware. And what's the problem with that? Well, the problem is environmental, which is this is consuming a lot of electricity. How much, you would say? Well, let's look at that. For competitive reason, actually, XRP Ripple has been doing those comparisons, and you can see that the Bitcoin ecosystem, if I look at that bottom left type of diagram, is consuming as much electricity as Portugal. Okay, and if you compare that to other protocol, well, you can see there where the environmental type of problem is. So not only the protocol, that type of protocol, which was designed in the first place for cryptocurrency, is totally inadequate for industrial DLT application, but they also, especially in the case of Bitcoin, there is an environmental dimension there, which kind of contradicts, for example, the European Union direction with green logistics. All right, so those four first challenges that I've been talking about are really generic. They are happening, and those debates are happening in the context of supply chain and logistics, but they're really broader than just logistics. Now, the four next challenge that I'm going to describe, and then the solution that I'm going to describe to basically illustrate what the problem is, they're really specific to those DLT supply chain and logistics implementation. The first of those problems is the ROI perspective, the return on investment perspective. When the first implementation in logistics started end of 2018, very large corporations, you know, your Ford and Toyota and just to name a few, but there were others. When those guys started building prototype and then putting their supply chain or attempting to put a supply chain on a DLT, they faced all the same issues, which is they were not able to justify the cost of implementing those projects. And the problem with that was a problem of perspective, which is those large corporations were looking at the ROI from the perspective of their organization. And the reason why they were doing that is because, well, they were the trigger and the catalyst for those implementation. They were the one investing, basically, and then activating those initiatives. But the issue with that is that this is the wrong way to approach this, because there's no way you're going to be able to justify financially the implementation of a supply chain ecosystem if you just look at the ROI from the perspective of one node in that ecosystem, no matter how big that node is. And so what's the solution to this? Well, the solution is really look, and when I say look, typically a third party is required, an independent, neutral third party need to look at the ROI from the total ecosystem perspective. And a good tactic is really start from the end, start from the end point of your supply chain, the end consumer, and then node by node, start looking at the value proposition, the ROI proposition from each node perspective. Only then you will be able to unleash, uncover, discover all the benefits of that ecosystem. The danger in looking at ROI purely from one node is that you might miss out on opportunities that you might not even think of. I'm talking about missed revenue opportunities or missed efficiencies opportunities that you might not think of at all if you look at this from purely the perspective of your own single node. So this is a common problem in DLT supply chain when the project is triggered by a single organization as opposed to an industry association, for example, or a cluster of organization. Second issue, and there's various dimensions there to that issue, complexity. Now, complexity, I'm not talking about complication, I'm talking about really the complexity in a sense, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, the enormity of a project. But the reality of those DLT supply chain and logistics projects is that they are incredibly complex. And the complexity comes from two, mostly one factor, but then the solution to that is actually what I'm proposing here on the right. The complexity comes from the number of actors. If you take, any type of, let's say, an automotive type of manufacturer, for example, that manufacturer alone, if you look at the supply chain, there's something like 50,000 different parts in a car. If you look at the supply chain, chances are that there's anywhere north of 1,500 to 2,000 vendors within the supply chain of that particular manufacturer. If that brand happens to have multiple factories around the world, that's probably multiply that by the number of factories, because the supply chain are probably very, very different from a factory to another, even if we produce the same product. So immediately you realize, well, if I'm trying to put all of those nodes in my ecosystem, this is a very, very complex project. And so that idea of complex project management is new. It's a new discipline. We know about project management, but project management on that scale is known, but has been until now a very, very niche type of approach. You had that, for example, on a large capital project type of initiatives, but it was not kind of an extensive type of discipline. So that discipline is emerging, it's strengthening, and we know that we need new ways of approaching project management when we are dealing with those large-scale, very complex projects. A particular or another way, aside from the tools, to circumvent that particular challenge is phasing, which is follow, and I'm proposing here the well-known TRL type of approach, right, which started with NASA and then was adopted, and is widely adopted in any type of large capital asset project. But follow a bit of a TRL approach. Don't try to achieve TRL 9 straight away, right? Maybe you build first a TRL 4 type of project, and then you play with it, and then you grow that to the next level in successive phases. So that is some of the feedback that we had from those first DLT supply chain projects. Now, complexity is also manifesting itself somewhere else, and that is with the protocol itself. And so if I go back to the two major industry DLT protocol currently in the market, so in one side Hyperledger and Sky on the other side, they're very, very different. And what is different about them is really the architecture and the way they thought about how they would align with the architectural systems that they would face. So in the case of Hyperledger, Hyperledger has been built as a connecting type of protocol. Why? From day one, IBM and Linux Foundation knew that they were going to target large corporations which had already large ERP system, which they would unlikely change because, well, those large systems get depreciated over decades, right? So they built a protocol which fundamentally, like an onion type of layer, sits on top of those systems. So is there a problem with that? Well, the problem is security. It's risk surface. And we're seeing that emerging in those implementation, which is when you build your protocol as a layer, what you do is you actually increase inherently the risk surface. And so that's the situation with Hyperledger. Oppositely, with Sky protocol, DLT is built at the core, and so you do not have that additional layer and that increase in risk surface. So here are some of the challenges faced there with complexity of architecture. Another challenge, which came very, very quickly end of 2018 with some of the very, very first implementation in logistics, what we called node asymmetry. So what is the problem there? Well, the problem is, going back to my manufacturing example with cars, for example, I've got 1,500 suppliers in my supply chain. I want to put them on the DLT ecosystem. And of course, I am a big brand and I've got the capacity to do that, possibly to lose money if I got it wrong on the ROI. But then all of a sudden, I am asking some of my smaller nodes in my supply chain to start investing in implementing integration with that ecosystem. And those smaller nodes might just say, no, why would we do that? What's the benefit for us? And so that problem is even more acute when the ROI has not been thought through. But the problem there was those large corporations are coming from a situation where they invest millions in large ERP system. They're used to it, they maintain, they probably have IT divisions and budget for this, where your smaller nodes, they might not have that. And so node asymmetry, a very, very acute problem, and a problem that the technologists could not solve easily because it's a commercial problem. When you develop systems and ERP and your approach to the market is top down, so you are targeting those large ticket customers, you don't necessarily have a ready to go bottom up, commercially designed solution for the smaller nodes in your supply chain. So this has created some frictions. You might say, can we skip those nodes? Well, you could, except that some of those nodes might be quite essential. So think about rare earth or particular logistics suppliers in a remote area, which are essential to your supply chain, and yet their size do not justify the investment required for them to be part of that ecosystem. So node asymmetry, one of the challenge. Now, another challenge with node, and this is really where that whole topic of interoperability between protocols started kicking in. That challenge is what we call power nodes. So let me take an example with that. Imagine you are a port authority or a tax office, okay? And a big manufacturer like Toyota or Ford or whoever approach you and say, look, we're putting our ecosystem, our supply chain on a DLT ecosystem. And of course, you are one of the node on our journey. So could you join? And of course, the reaction of those regulated node, port authority, tax office, et cetera, is why? Why would I go? And the why there is a bit different. The why is not about how much. The why is, why would I go with your project where I've got someone else, one of your peers telling me they're going with that protocol or this one or this one or this one. So the key problem that Port Authority very quickly, end of 2018, have faced, and not just Port Authority or the nodes too, is an interoperability challenge, which is how do we build a system by which we do not take or do not select basically a particular protocol, but on the contrary, have an open approach to any type of protocol so that we do not take sides and we remain neutral. Now, you might say, well, isn't that a question of standard? And when your reaction is like that, it's because you're probably thinking SMTP and email, 1996, different protocol in email, all the providers coming together and defining the SMTP protocol so that all email can navigate. But the issue with that is blockchain is not email. And what the market is telling us right now is that the number of protocols is actually expanding. It's not reducing. And the solution that some are trying to put forward, what we call the meta chain, doesn't work. It's not working. It's been there around for quite a number of years. And what's becoming ridiculous is that you've got now more meta chains than DLT protocol themselves. So all of those solutions are not really working. One of the most interesting solutions we're seeing right now is really a DSL chain one. Why? The position of DSL chain is the problem of interoperability has already been solved. And what they're saying is, if you look at the fintech world, there is a particular type of entities that nobody likes. They don't like it, but it's there, it exists, it's a reality, and that is the exchange. And those exchanges, typically, they are regulated. And so what DSL Chain is saying is, well, in the same way we've got crypto exchange, we need DLT data exchange. And those exchanges should actually be regulated because of the criticality, basically, of the data exchange between different protocols which occur during those transactions. And so the model that they are proposing, which is an interesting one, is marry up RegTech with DLT data port exchange and actually push those solutions toward those nodes who are experiencing the problem in the first place, and these are power nodes, so regulated type of nodes such as port authorities. So that's probably one of the most exciting solutions out there right now. And on that note, we got 4 minutes. So sorry, I know there was probably a lot of information, but basically that concludes the workshop. And I'm open to any question that you might have now, or I'm happy to liaise with any of you through the blog pool, basically chat if you have any questions.
Interesting, Giovanni. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you for inviting me to present there.
We have had 2 very intense days, so maybe participants are already very tired. But don't hesitate to ask any question you might have. Simone is saying that we have material for a full day only with this presentation. That is actually quite true.
And listen, this is really my point earlier, and I started with that. I actually just show you a very, very small snapshot of what the logistics topic is all about. It's the course that I mentioned, which is a full course organized by a Baltic Port Association. That's 10 hours of course, so doing that in 1 hour was very, very challenging. And I appreciate that there's a lot of material there, and I hope I have not rushed, but I hope I have basically provided you a bit of an overview on DLT, industrial DLT applied to logistics. I know it's the end of the day, so you're probably all very, very tired. And but look, feel free to communicate with me if you have any question tomorrow or the day after. I'm happy to contribute. Carmen, thanks to Insomnia and Blockpool for inviting me, and I think we are right on time.
Yeah, thank you for accepting the challenge. I think participants are also very happy to have received this presentation. So thank you very much for summarizing all of this in just 1 hour. And yes, sure, they have your contacts. They are free to connect with you and to keep the discussion. Okay. So thank you, Giovanni, very much.
You're welcome.
With this, I think we can close this 3rd bootcamp. So thank you for the 17 participants that still have energy here. Thank you very much for staying with us. I hope you had a nice 2 days. You have learned, you have enjoyed, you have just share the experience, and this will help you to keep growing. So honestly, thank you very much for joining. I think that the participation was during the whole bootcamp quite high, so I also appreciate that. And yes, thank you, and we keep in touch because this is not over. We still have one more month. So we keep in touch. Go Blockpool, yes.
Thank you all, and I will take a leave now. And thanks, and good luck, and keep in touch if you need any more information.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Maybe Luis, you want to share that you have an event coming this afternoon for those who still have energy, and invite people to just join. I think he left. So guys, I think he left. Yes, because he's having an event and inviting in the Slack channel to the companies to join in case you still have energy. But if not, yeah, as I said, just keep in touch and stay safe. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.